Drugs and Forensic Toxicology, Part 1. The common denominator to all drug use is psychological dependence. So, psychological dependence. This is when a patient who has taken a drug or a medicine for a long time wants to continue taking it because it produces this feeling of well-being. So, if this patient all of a sudden stops taking the medicine, it can lead to what's known as psychological withdrawal symptoms, which includes anxiety, cravings, as shown by this guy, irritability, insomnia, and depression. So although emotional well-being is the primary motive to repeated and intensive use of a drug, certain drugs taken in sufficient doses and frequency can actually produce what's known as physiological dependence or physical dependence. And if the user abstains from taking such a drug, this can lead to severe physical illness, which some examples include body chills, vomiting, stomach cramps, etc. So in addition, there's what is known as physiological tolerance or drug tolerance. And this is when a subject's reaction to a drug decreases so that the larger doses are required to achieve the same effect. Drugs are natural or synthetic substances that are used to produce physiological or psychological effects in humans or other animals. And the first class of drugs we're going to discuss are the opioids, or known as narcotics. Narcotic comes from the Greek word narkotikos, for stupor. And these are a class of drugs that relieve pain and produce sleep. On the flip side, they also produce this high sense of profound euphoria. And they're used as pain reliever because they have a high potency as a pain reliever. And as I've stated before, since they promote sleep, and then they induce analgesia, they're known as analgesics. And they relieve pain by depressing the central nervous system. They have the sedative and hypnotic properties as well as analgesic properties. And we'll go into a little bit further, but they act stereospecifically on the endorphin or enkephalin receptors. And they are one of the oldest psychotropic drugs that have been used for over 7,000 years. There are three distinct families of endogenous opioid peptides identified thus far. They include the enkephalins, the endorphins, and the dynorphins. They're basically all endorphins, but they're derived from different precursor polypeptides, which consist of more than 200 amino acids, and they have different anatomical distribution. The precursor is cleaved into an active opioid by a protease, and the physiological roles of these different endogenous opioid peptides are still not well understood. Opium is the latex or the gummy milky juice, as seen here, made in an unripe pod of the Asian poppy or from the opium poppies, also known as Papaver somniferium. Morphine is derived from this milky juice, and codeine is an alkaloid in opium and other poppy saps, but it's also synthesized from morphine through O-methylation, and it is 1/6 as potent. However, because it's an alkaloid, it can readily be absorbed orally. The two types of opioids or narcotics include semi-synthetic and synthetic. The semi-synthetic is a simple modification of morphine or codeine, and these include hydromorphone, hydrocodone, oxymorphone, and oxycodone. Synthetic does not start with morphine or codeine at all, and they're not strictly similar to them, and these include fentanyls. One type of semi-synthetic opioid or narcotic is heroin or diacetylmorphine, and this heroin is produced by reacting morphine with acetic anhydride or acetyl chloride, and which makes it soluble in water so it can be injected, which maximizes sensitivity of effects and almost instantaneous effects. And it is less polar than morphine, so it readily penetrates the blood-brain barrier and enters the central nervous system. Once inside the brain, heroin is metabolized into morphine in the brain, and because it's in the brain more quickly, heroin effects is more rapid and intense. And heroin produces a sense of euphoria, and then it's accompanied by drowsiness and deep sense of well-being, which lasts about 3 to 4 hours. A synthetic drug is methadone, which is chemically unlike morphine or heroin, but it acts on the opioid receptors. It is absorbed orally and has this very long duration of action. it takes about 24 hours. And the mood elevating effects, or the euphoric effects, are actually gradual and quite stable. And it is used to mitigate opioid withdrawal syndromes because it's active at opioid receptors. However, it reduces cravings for narcotics and reduces this motivation to do drugs. There are three distinct opioid receptors identified. There's the mu pain modulating receptors that mediate euphorogenic properties, and these are in the thalamus, midbrain, and reticular formation. There's the delta receptors in the emotion modulating brain areas, which include the limbic system, and there's the kappa sedating analgesia receptors in the deep layers of the cerebral cortex. The endorphins, or these receptors, modulate the central reward circuit, which include the ventral tegmental area as well as the nucleus accumbens. And other structures that are modulated by these endorphins include amygdala, locus coeruleus, the arcuate nucleus, and the periaqueductal gray matter, as well as the thalamus. So we're only going to focus on the endorphins. In the ventral tegmental area, these endorphins act on mu receptors on the dendrites of these GABAergic interneurons. And what these GABAergic interneurons do is they actually inhibit these dopaminergic neurons that project from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens from releasing dopamine. So if you are engaged in a sport or another activity that raises natural endorphin levels, or if you take an exogenous opiate, this suppresses the release of GABA and thus removes this GABAergic interneuron inhibition, and then on these dopaminergic neurons. Consequently, the nucleus accumbens is even more stimulated by dopamine from the dopaminergic neurons of the ventral tegmental area, and thus we have this sense of euphoria. So some of the effects of the opioids or narcotics include this respiratory depression. So in the medulla, the opioids decrease the rate and depth of breathing, so you have this respiratory depression, as well as it suppresses this cough reflex. It slows the movement of contents in the GI tract, which results in constipation, and increases our susceptibility to infections because it suppresses antibody production, alters white blood cell ability to respond to white blood cell transformation factors, and decreases the toxicity of natural killer cells. This class of drugs we'll be discussing are the psychostimulants. They enhance the activity of the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. It's a class of psychoactive drugs that temporarily improve mental or physical function, or possibly both. They increase vigilance and alertness. They are known to reduce fatigue and your tendency to sleep. They include one of the most widely used behaviorally active drug, which is caffeine, also referred to as methylxanthines. Caffeine readily crosses the blood-brain barrier, and once inside the brain, it blocks the inhibition of the synaptic transmission of the central nervous system. It is an antagonist of the adenosine receptor because it's structurally similar to adenosine. And it binds to these adenosine receptors on the surface of cells without activating them. And what adenosine does is it acts to protect the brain by suppressing neural activity. So now we have this inhibition of the suppression of the neural activity. And thus we have an increased firing of these cortical neurons, as well as the part of the brain that is the major regulator of arousal and vigilance, which is the locus coeruleus. And the reinforcing effects of caffeine is due to its ability to terminate the caffeine withdrawal symptoms. Amphetamines, also known as speed, was initially used in inhalers to treat asthma, and it's used currently to increase wakefulness and focus and decrease fatigue and appetite, which is why it's popularly used in weight loss. And it's psychologically dependent. It produces this profound sense of euphoria, feelings of well-being, and enhanced self-confidence in both physical and mental abilities. It is used in the treatment of narcolepsy for people who fall asleep repeatedly during the day without warning, and as a methylphenidate or Ritalin for attention deficit disorder. And this low to moderate dose increases energy, concentration, alertness, self-confidence, and mood elevation. Amphetamines, also known as ice, crank, meth, crystal, is highly lipid soluble due to the methyl group. This methamphetamine hydrochloride has a rapid onset and can last several hours, up to 7 hours. And it increases alertness and energy, and induces a sense of well-being, euphoria, and enhanced self-confidence. Chronic exposure can precipitate psychosis that's similar to paranoid schizophrenia. And these include very stereotyped and repetitive behavior, continuous chewing, rubbing of the tongue on inside of lips, teeth grinding, and engagement in repetitious thought or meaningless acts for hours, and sometimes violent, destructive behavior. So methamphetamine hydrochloride is more lipid soluble, and it's actually quite stable. And what it does is it induces the release of norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin through transporters, and thus it increases the stimulation of postsynaptic receptors. In addition, since it blocks the reuptake pumps, it prevents the reuptake of dopamine, so now we have an overstimulation of dopamine within the postsynaptic synapse. Main areas of the brain that's impacted by methamphetamine hydrochloride include the mesolimbic as well as the mesocortical reward pathway. Since methamphetamine is neurotoxic, they have shown that there's a dopaminergic and serotonergic degeneration from use of methamphetamine hydrochloride. Another class of psychostimulants include cocaine. For centuries, South American Indians have been using cocaine to increase endurance and reduce fatigue and hunger. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous detective Sherlock Holmes injected cocaine between cases, and however the effects were sometimes confused with those of opiates. In addition, initially supported cocaine's clinical use as antidepressants and anti-fatigue by Sigmund Freud, he tested it on himself and his friends, but eventually became disillusioned. South American Indians do not suffer from the addiction or the side effects or toxicity like North Americans. South American Indians chew the coca leaves, which contain very small amounts of cocaine, and since it's an alkaloid, it is slowly absorbed from the GI tract and there's little accumulation in the brain. North Americans self-administer high concentrated forms intranasally, so that it's absorbed through the nasal membrane, and thus they have a faster onset of action and higher brain concentration than orally ingestion. Cocaine can also be administered intravenously or through inhalation, which also results in a rapid and high concentration of drug in the brain. So cocaine hydrochloride is usually administered intranasally. It is sniffed or snorted, so it is absorbed through the nasal membrane and has a faster onset of action and a higher brain concentration than if it was orally ingested. The local vasoconstrictive properties actually result in slower absorption and longer effects. The quickest way to administer a drug is through inhalation. However, cocaine hydrochloride is volatilized at temperatures that degraded. So if you try to burn cocaine hydrochloride, it'll burn with no effect. So what they do is they reconvert to an alkaloid state, which is called free-base cocaine, with baking soda and water. So when it is volatilized, it vaporizes at 194 degrees Fahrenheit, and thus you get a quick absorption into the bloodstream, about 8 seconds, and it's more potent. However, the euphoria lasts about 15 seconds and fades quickly. So cocaine hydrochloride blocks the dopamine transporter protein, so it increases dopaminergic activity, and it has a similar psychological effect as amphetamines, but it's a lot shorter. And so by blocking the dopamine transporter protein, dopamine can no longer perform reuptake function, and thus you have an enhanced or prolonged postsynaptic effect of the dopamine. An interesting fact, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson was written in 6 Days and Nights under influence of cocaine, and the demonic murder form of Mr. Hyde was modeled after cocaine. Eyeballing is known as the taking the cocaine and heroin in combination, either injecting the two drugs serially or by combining the drugs in solution and taking them simultaneously. The rewarding effects of cocaine and heroin has been attributed to an increase in the functional activity of the mesolimbic dopamine neurons. The cocaine acts as a stimulant, raising the heartbeat, but its effects wear off more quickly than those of heroin, which in turn slows the heart. As a result, it is possible to experience a delayed overdose, technically known as a severe respiratory depression, when the stimulant wears off and the full effects of heroin are felt in isolation. Some celebrities that have died this way include Chris Farley, River Phoenix, Tim Buckley, and Jean-Michel Basquiat, as well as Elvis Presley, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix. The next class of drugs are hallucinogens. They elicit visual or auditory hallucinations, depersonalization, perceptual disturbances, and disturbances of thought processes. These include psychotomimetics, which are psychosis mimicking, psychotogenic, psychosis generating, psychosis, which are gross distortion or organization of mental capacity, affective response and capacity to recognize reality, communicate and relate to others, and psychedelics, which are mind-expanding, manifesting, clarifying, and revealing. Hallucinogens gain reinforcing value from ability to alter consciousness and perceptual processes, not primarily on the effects of the primary reward centers of the brain. And the basic molecular structure is similar to monoamine neurotransmitters, which are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. A hallucinogen is lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. In 1938, it was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann while working with ergot derivatives. And in 1943, he described a profound effect on consciousness after he accidentally ingested the compound while working on it in the laboratory. It is one of the most potent pharmacological agents known. It produces marked changes in mood, can lead to laughing or crying at slight provocation. Feelings of anxiety and tension are often perceptual alterations, visual, auditory, or tactile, and extreme distortions of physical environment and hallucinations at high dose. It also induces synesthesia, this transposition of sensations such as sounds into visual images, and at very high doses it could produce a dysphoric reaction, also known as a bad trip. They believe it may have been the cause of abnormal sensations and hallucinations that were reported by victims of the Salem witch trials in the 1700s. LSD is administered orally. It could be taken as a pill, added to a cube of sugar, or absorbed onto a small piece of paper. And it's absorbed within 30 to 60 minutes. And 25 micrograms can start vivid hallucinations that can last up to 12 hours. And it has high lipid solubility and rapidly penetrates the blood-brain barrier, and it could stay up in the body up to 15 hours. And its action is linked to the serotonergic neurons of the reticular activating system. 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or also known as MDMA or ecstasy, is a catecholamine type PPH, which include mescaline and 3,4-methylene dioxyamphetamines, or MDA. It is an enactogenic drug, so it has distinctive emotional and social effects, and the chemical structure includes a substituted amphetamine core, but belongs to the phenethylamine class of psychoactive drugs. MDMA produces this feeling of more empathy, insightfulness, and awareness, and enhanced communication, euphoria, and generally free of hallucinations, and induces this release of serotonin into the synapse, and it blocks the reuptake of serotonin. However, one of the negative effects includes elevation of blood pressure and pulse, muscle tension and jaw clenching, fatigue, insomnia, sweating, and blurred vision, loss of motor coordination, and anxiety. And chronic abuse can lead to seizures, muscle breakdown, stroke, kidney failure, and cardiovascular system failure. And long-term and possibly irreversible effects of serotonergic systems in the brain. One of the ideas that are under debate is the neurotoxicity of MDMA. Type of hallucinogen is cannabis sativa, and it's used as a medicinal herb since 2737 BC. Marijuana comes from the Mexican Spanish word marijuana, meaning intoxicant, and it refers to the plant and not the drug. Marijuana contains over 400 different chemicals, more than 60 specific to cannabis, referred to cannabinoids. Major psychoactive chemical is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Two other cannabinoids are cannabinol and cannabidiol, concentrations modified to THC effects. It is highly lipid soluble and can be absorbed orally. Cannabinoid receptors are found in high levels in areas of brain that alter mood and cognition. These include the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and the amygdala. When the THC binds to the cannabinoid receptor, it blocks the release of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, thus increasing the release of dopamine. The acute effects is also known as being stoned, and it's a dose-dependent impairment of memory, cognitive functions such as attending, speaking, problem-solving, concept formation, and complex psychomotor skills. In addition, there is a stimulation of appetite. Another class of drugs are the dissociative anesthetics. They are markedly different from psychedelics such as LSD and mushrooms, where alert and fully conscious users experience cognitive alterations while simultaneously interacting with the real world. In contrast, dissociatives are marked by more internal effects such as closed eye visuals and detachment from the surrounding environment. Dissociative anesthetics include phencyclidine or PCP, ketamine, dextromethorphan, and nitrous oxide. And they involve a variety of neurotransmitter, but some are NMDA receptor antagonists, where NMDA receptor normally binds to glutamine. Its effects include an individual being awake but disconnected from the environment. They also have euphoric senses, distortions of body image, feelings of depersonalization, and sense of timelessness, transient feeling of being in outer space or dead, or not having any arms or legs. Symptoms are similar to schizophrenia, which include global paranoia, persecutory and grandiose delusions, auditory hallucinations, suspiciousness with extreme anger and terror. Sedative, hypnotic, and anxiolytics are drugs that treat symptoms of anxiety. They include anti-anxiety and antipsychotic drugs, anticonvulsants, and muscle relaxants, which reduce the variety of aggressive tendencies and decrease anxiety. They include benzodiazepines, barbiturates, flunitrazepam, and alcohol. And they bind to the GABA receptors, thus decreasing the excitability of neurons throughout the nervous